Hello everyone and thank you for attending to this presentation. My name is Lucas, I'm a PhD student from France, and today I will talk to you about our work which concerns online scheduling applied to a graph of moldable tasks. In the scheduling literature, we often distinguish two types of scheduling. The first one is offline scheduling, when all tasks are known before the start of the execution. This problem is NP-complete, and the goal is usually to build algorithms executing in polynomial time that are always within a certain factor from the optimal time. In opposition, in online scheduling, you don't know the tasks until you are actually able to process them, which prevents from long-term strategies. In this work, we focused on the second scenario. The online scheduling problem is widely studied in the case of independent tasks, where tasks have release dates and arrive during the execution. However, here we chose to study online task graphs, where the graph is released at the start of the execution, but the dependents are unknown and tasks are discovered only when the precedence constraints are respected. To illustrate online scheduling for task graphs, let me show you a small example. The whole graph of tasks is released at time 0, however the scheduler is only aware of tasks A, as the others are not ready yet. After finishing completion of task A, B and C becomes available because their only predecessor was task A. In this model, we also consider that we know exactly the details of their execution time. Even when task B is completed, the scheduler is not aware of the existence of task D yet, because one of its predecessors, task C, is not completed. But after task C is completed, task D becomes known. Finally, when task D is done, task E and F become available and the execution finishes. I will now give you more details about the models which we use in this work. In the scheduling literature, there are three different models for tasks. The first one is rigid task, when the number of processors is fixed and may not be chosen by the scheduler. The second one is moldable tasks, where the scheduler can choose the number of processors used to process a task, but need to stick to this decision from the moment the task starts. The scheduler fully knows the length of the task for any processor allocation. Finally, the last model is malleable tasks, where the scheduler can change the number of processors even during the processing. We chose to work on moldable tasks because it is more flexible than rigid tasks, but easier to design than malleable tasks so that they are actually used in practice. For instance, many scientific libraries use them. Formally, we assume we want to schedule n-dependent moldable tasks with precedence constraints that are released when all their predecessor has completed. We have P processors available to schedule them, and each task has an execution time which is a function of the number of Pj of processor allocated to it. This function is considered fully known whenever the task is released. Finally, we define the area as the total workload of a task for a given processor allocation, which is the number of processors multiplied by the time. For the time function, we considered three classic speedup models and their extension. The first one, the Roofland model, is fully parallelizable up to a certain maximum degree of parallelism, after which adding more processors is useless. The second one, the communication model, has a fully parallelizable works, but there is also an extra cost for communication that increases linearly with the number of processors. The third one has also a fully parallelizable fraction of the work, but also a sequential fraction gamma j that may not be accelerated. Then we considered the extension of these three models as a general model that has a fully parallelizable part up to a certain degree, a sequential fraction, and communication costs. Therefore, each of the three first models is a special case of the general model. Finally, in the arbitrary model, there is no supposition of the shape of the time function whatsoever. Let us now define the scheduling objectives. We wish to minimize the max span of our graph of tasks, which corresponds to the maximum time of completion among all tasks. Furthermore, it needs to respect the two following constraints. First, we may never use more than the total number of processors available for a given time. Second, a task may start only when all its predecessors are completed. Not that these constraints are identical both for online and offline scheduling, but it is obvious for online scheduling because we are not even aware of the tasks. We evaluate the quality of our algorithm with competitive ratio. Formally, if T-opt is the best offline max span achievable, and the max span of our algorithm is always within a factor r from the optimal for any instance, it is said to be R competitive. We will try to find the smallest R as possible for our algorithm. So this work focuses on designing new algorithms for this problem and derives their competitive ratio with analysis as tight as possible. To that extent, and for every speedup model defined earlier, we provided both higher bounds on competitive ratio and lower bounds using instances where the algorithm behaves as bad as possible. The gap between higher and lower bounds is usually very small, showing the tightness of the analysis. Finally, we also provided the negative results on the arbitrary speedup model, showing that no deterministic online algorithm have a constant competitive ratio using an adversary. Now that the contest is settled, I will present to you the algorithm. Let's begin with some preliminaries. To design algorithm with competitive ratio, we must build the lower bounds on the up. More precisely, we use two values that are easy to compute for a given allocation: the total area, which is the sum on the area of all tasks, and the critical path, which is the longest path for a given allocation. We define A-min as the area when each task has an allocation minimizing its area, and C-min as a critical path where each task has an allocation minimizing the time of execution. Clearly, one may not beat a schedule where the P processors are always working and the area is minimal. Thus, A-min over P is a lower bound on the best time of execution. Similarly, as we may not process the critical path of the graph of tasks faster than C-min, it is a lower bound as well, and so is L-min, the maximum of these two values. Let's now move on to the algorithm. First, we need to decide how much processor we should use for each task. Our algorithm uses a special parameter mu that will be defined accordingly to speedup models to achieve the best possible results. Given this mu(n) for each task, the first step is to find the allocation minimizing the area respecting a time constraint. We denote as alpha p the ratio between the area of our allocation and the minimum area, and beta p is defined analogously with the time function. Beta p may not be higher than a certain function of mu, which is derived from the analysis, as you will see later. The second part of the allocation procedure is that we want to make sure that the allocation doesn't use a fraction of processor larger than mu, which prevents some terrible decision in the schedule. This reduction comes from Lepel's work in 2001. Note that this allocation procedure only depends on the local parameter of the tasks, but we don't have a choice as we are doing online scheduling. Our scheduling algorithm consists of applying the processor allocation procedure whenever a task is released, and try to schedule it right away if possible. If not, we store the task in a list of available tasks, and we process this list whenever a task completes. In that case, we schedule available tasks until no task remains. For the four introduced speedup models, we derive the choice of mu minimizing the competitive ratio using our analysis. It might not be the optimal choice, but should be close regarding the tightness of our algorithm. The results are shown in the table below. Now that I introduce the algorithm to you, I will move on to the analysis. Of course, I won't present the details within 5 minutes, but I will try to give an intuition on how to upper bound the approximation ratio and how to find the best choice of mu. To do the analysis, we subdivide any schedule into 3 sets of time steps: I1, I2, and I3, depending on the number of processors used. In I1, at most mu p processors are used. In I2, between mu p and 1 minus mu p processors are used, and in I3, more than 1 minus mu p of them are used. The purpose of reduction is that if we are in I1 or I2, no tasks are ready because there are enough room to process any task. This means that the path lies in I1 and I2. Furthermore, no tasks have been reduced in I1, which gives additional information on the time of the task processing in I1. Finally, in I2 and I3, we know we are somewhat efficient, because we use at least a fraction mu or 1 minus mu of processors. Using these 3 intervals, we are able to build 2 bounds. The first one is a critical path bound. Lepel showed that there exists a path such that I1 and I2 are included in the processing of the path. We know that the non-reducted tasks are within a factor beta from their minimal time, and the reducted tasks are within a factor 1 over mu from the optimal, which gives equation 1. Similarly, at least a fraction mu of the processors are used in I2, and a fraction 1 minus mu in I3. As all tasks are within a factor alpha from their minimum area, we get equation 2. We can combine these two equations with t is equal to I1 plus I2 plus I3, and we obtain the final ratio given in the proposition above. From this equation, the only thing to do is to compute for each speedup model an upper bound on alpha as a function of mu, to obtain a final ratio depending only on mu. The minimization of this ratio gives a choice of mu, and the results in terms of ratio. I will finally give you an intuition on how to build the worst possible instance for a speedup model, and how to find negative results on general algorithms. Here, I show the general graph to build lower bounds on competitive ratio, for which the task's details depend on the speedup model. It consists of three types of tasks. The tasks labeled with A are short and perfectly parallelizable. The tasks in B are longer and will have a higher area running our heuristics, whereas the tasks in C is very long but still have negligible area compared to the tasks in B. The allocation of our algorithm will be so that it is not possible to compute a full layer in parallel, and therefore it might process the tasks of type B before the tasks of type A. If so, if this is always the case, this will give the schedule shown in A, when the area of tasks in B is maximized, and the fraction of processor used is barely above 1 minus mu for most of the processing, which is the worst possible processor utilization given that some tasks are ready. Finally, when all tasks of type A and B are completed, task C will be processed with a time as high as possible. However, this instance will also be built so that after processing all tasks in A, you can allocate a single processor to all tasks in B in parallel with task C, reduced to its minimum time. This makes all the bounds tight, except the alpha in the allocation procedure for some models, which explains the low gap between higher and lower bounds. Finally, I will show you how to build a negative result for the competitive ratio in the general case. The instance is as follows. All tasks are identical, so no algorithm can distinguish them. Half of the tasks have only one repetition, half of the remaining one have two repetitions, etc. If you allocate 2 to the power I-1 processors for all tasks of group I, the time function and the number of processors will be fixed so that the processing time of all group is exactly 1, and so that they can all be processed in parallel. However, a deterministic algorithm has no way to determine the number of repetitions for each task. If it is unlucky, the first repetition of any task of group 2 will not be completed before the total completion of group 1. Similarly, the second repetition of any task in group 3 might not be completed before the total completion of group 2. In the meantime, one repetition of all tasks in group I may not be done in time lower than 1 divided by L plus I, based on time and area analysis that I'm going to skip here. So in this example, processing all tasks in group 1 takes time at least 1/3, processing one repetition of each task in group 2 takes time at least 1/4, and so on. Therefore, if we are not lucky, the total time of execution under that scenario may not be sub-logarithmic in k, and thus is not constant. Let's finally move on to the conclusion. In this paper, we have studied the problem of online scheduling for moldable parallel tasks with precedence constraints. We have provided an efficient algorithm and have proven several new competitive ratios on this problem, as well as the first non-constant lower bound on competitive ratio for any deterministic algorithm. For future theoretical work, we will try to improve the allocation analysis, which corresponds to the upper bound of alpha for a given mu. A perfect computation of alpha should close the gap between upper and lower bounds in the approximation ratio. We will also evaluate experimentally the performance of the proposed scheduling algorithm. Thank you for listening. I'm open for any question you may have.